into that one, didn't he? I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that September 11th is also my birthday. I mean, talking about a lot going on, so. Dad was planning on coming tonight, and then he called and found out I was preaching, and then he decided he wasn't going to come. But then, thankfully, he came anyway, so. So as Brother Phil said, Jonah is where we will be, so we're going to go around a little bit, but the book of Jonah is where we will continue to come back to. I've been teaching Jonah, or I had been teaching Jonah in Sunday school, and I kind of, as I'm going through, studying and everything, I kind of realized that I had lived most of my entire life, and I think I totally missed most of the points of Jonah. Like, the more I studied it, the more I realized that, man, there's just a whole lot in there. Now, on the other side of that, there's a whole lot that's not in there that I wish was in there. And I know that, obviously God did that for a reason. So that I was talking to Brother Phil about that the other day. Deciding, where it's appropriate and where it's good to kind of dig in and figure things out, and where you're just really you're overthinking it. You're getting into it too much. So there are going to be some times where that might happen, but I do think that it is it's fun to discuss as well. And evidently someone, maybe it's me, really needs Jonah, because I understand Brother Mark has been teaching it in his Sunday school class as well. So somebody in here really needs it. And it's probably me. But the book of Jonah is an interesting book. Jonah is a very transparent character. He is a very honest. It's a very honest story. He's very clear about why or what he thinks. He's not necessarily, we don't always get his motives behind what he does, but he is very transparent. It's not, you don't have to figure out what he's thinking. He's not afraid to share that. And his name, Jonah, means dove. He is the son of Amittai, which means truth. So essentially, he's the son of truth. He isn't afraid to speak his truth, for sure. And obviously it's a very popular story. It's been told over and over and over again. It's, kind of popular, it's amongst the kids because of the big fish, right? Any kind of story that has animals in it, it's just fun to tell. And it's fun to retell. And it's a very poetic kind of book. It's an easy story to retell. It's something that we're all probably very familiar with. It's a small book. It's only 4 chapters long, only 48 verses. But I really do think that we need the Paul Harvey rest of the story. I can't wait. It's one of the things, when you get to heaven, that you're going to that I'm going to have to ask Jonah, okay, now go ahead and finish it off. It ends kind of abruptly. You don't tell where you go, what you do. Now, the Bible doesn't say for sure who wrote the book of Jonah, but, by all indication, Jonah himself wrote the book. He would be the only one that would really have all the details that's in there. But there's only 2 names mentioned in the entire book of Jonah, and that's Jonah and God. None of the other characters, none of the other people that are involved have a name or, whatever. So it's very interesting. He's from Gath-Hepher, which is kind of northeast of the Mediterranean Sea. It's, in the northern kingdom of Israel. And that was where he was from. The time frame, I've looked at a bunch of different, when this story happens, because since there's no king of Assyria named in the book of Jonah, we don't know exactly when it happened. But we know it was during the reign of Jeroboam II, which is, 760 to 862-ish. So there's a wide variety of opinions out there. 790 to 750 kind of seems to be the main where most people end up. There's obviously a lot of unbelievable miracles in the book. There's a lot of, big miracles, big stories, big events that happen, which is why a lot of people believe that it's an allegorical book, that it's just a story. It didn't really happen, which obviously I think is false. The Bible gives no indication of that. It names Jonah. And as a matter of fact, let's flip over to Matthew real quick. Keep your finger in Jonah. We'll come back. But flip over to Matthew chapter 12. And we'll read verses 38 to 41. And here, Matthew chapter 12, 38 through 41. Then certain of the scribes and the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee. But he answered and said unto them, An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. For as Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonas, and behold, a greater than Jonas is here. So here, Jesus is, talking to the scribes and Pharisees here, and they want a sign. And Jesus says, you're not going to get one, but, and he goes on, and we just read it, obviously. But Jesus is telling the story. He knew that Jonah was a person, and he believed that, he said that Jonah happened. So, apart from the fact that Jonah is, named and seems to be a true story, it is a true story. Jesus also confirmed that. So it's definitely not allegorical. I've listened to a lot of different people speak on Jonah. The Jews that I heard speak, they were ones that really kind of believed that it's an allegorical tale. Several of the Jews that I listened to about kind of telling the story, was just a lesson that needed to be learned. It was a way to convey a message through generation. And obviously that's true. It's a good lesson, and it's an easy story to tell. But it is true. It did happen. It is of historical significance. But in the book of Jonah, there's a ton of stuff. So does anybody want to tell what most prominent to them from the story of Jonah? Because there's a lot. I used to think there was just this one little story. Anybody? Brother Mark should have at least 1 or 4. No, you don't have to. What's the most prominent? Oh, Tucker. He did run. Yes, he ran from God. He ran away from Nineveh. That is the big part of the story, right? Tucker's doing next week's lesson. He got on a ship and sailed away. Absolutely. The importance of obedience, right? That's the big one. That was the lesson that I taught, the book that I taught out of. It was a whale of a lesson in obedience, was the name of the book. Absolutely. Is that what you were going to say too? Awful testimony on the boat. Absolutely. Nothing. Does nothing to help. And we're going to get to that tonight. But all of this chaos going around, excellent opportunity to share the love of God, to prove himself in some way, nothing. He dared to be angry at God. Not many people, well, let me say it again. We all do it, right? But we don't all vocalize it. And he did vocalize it. He didn't, and he wasn't bashful about it at all. Which I think is an interesting point as to maybe why God chose him, right? His willingness to be the son of truth. Be the guy that's going to say what he thinks. Now, obviously God had to, help him with what he thought a little bit. But yeah, so many lessons from the story of Jonah. So many things that you can get out of it. And so we're going to go through verse by verse for the next 4 weeks, unless, it takes longer than that. But hopefully we can get it done in 4 weeks. I think we can. But we'll read Jonah, verse number 1. Chapter 1, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying. Now, obviously, the word of the Lord came to Jonah. We already dealt with he's the son of Amittai, Amittai meaning truth. But here in verse 1, we see that Jonah was a prophet. A lot of people believe that he might have been part of those prophets that trained under Elisha. So he was an educated man, whether he trained under Elisha or not. But he was a prophet of God. And we see, and we'll go back to 2 Kings here, a couple books, where Jonah was first mentioned in the Bible. And this is one that I really didn't know either until I really kind of started studying it, was that Jonah is mentioned in another part of the Bible, in 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse number 25. And we'll come back to this verse a little bit later. But for the sake of for this part of it, he restored the coast of Israel from the entering of Hamath unto the sea of the plain, according to the word of the Lord of God of Israel, which he spake by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, which was of Gath-hepher. So we see that definitely Jonah was a prophet of God. He was a man that was called to deliver messages, and that's one of the marks of a prophet, right? Several of the marks of the prophet. One is that they're called by God, right? This wasn't a self-appointed thing. All right, I'm going to prophesy. Didn't work like that. God had to call them. They had to be called of God. Secondly, they had a message that they were to share, right? They were given a specific message. God called them to deliver a specific message to a specific person or group of people or whatever the case may be. And the last thing that really the prophets, it was essential to be a prophet, was that those messages had to come to pass, right? We think of, you hear in the story people that, predict the future, and, Nostradamus was, is a big one that comes up in the world as somebody that could see the future, tell the future. And nothing that he ever said really came to pass, Even a blind squirrel can find a nut every once in a while, as my Uncle Marvin would say. You talk enough, you predict enough, something's bound to happen. But not with prophets. With prophets, what they said had to come to pass. Let's turn over to Deuteronomy real quick. Deuteronomy chapter 18. I was telling Brother Larry that I didn't ever realize how many verses I used when I taught until I had to write it on the little sheet to tell all the passages I was going to turn to. Deuteronomy 18, verse 20 through 22. But the prophet, which shall presume to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, even that prophet shall die. And if thou say in thine heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord hath not spoken? When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the things follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken. But the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not be afraid of him. So very clear here. God says, if a prophet tells you something, says something's going to happen, and it doesn't happen, don't worry about it. You ain't got to be afraid of him. He's speaking presumptuously. He's not a prophet of God. Now, this fact comes in later on down the road a little bit, I think, for Jonah. And we'll come back to that probably in a couple weeks. But a prophet had to give a message, and it had to be accurate. It had to come to pass every time. And the word of the Lord has come to all of us today. And we've all been given a message just like Jonah was. Now, Jonah's message was not one, and we'll get to it here in verse 2, not one of joy, whereas ours is, right? We all have a message that we're supposed to give of, the gospel, good news, right? Of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, the fact that we can live forever. And we have the same directive that Jonah had. We're supposed to share that to everyone, which seems to be a little bit harder than just go to the one city, right? I don't know. But we have a message today as well. And it's our job, just like it was Jonah's job, to get that message out. And we see here, and we'll go on here in verse 2. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me. Here we can see a verse of action, right? Verse 2 is a verse of action. There's 3 action words that he uses there. First off, arise. Secondly, go. Thirdly, cry, right? And once again, that great commission that we have to go is very similar to these action words. We're to go, teach, preach, baptize. Very similar is our call. And it's a very simple call, right? Not necessarily easy. Jonah's message wasn't going to be easy. He was going to a place, according to the Veggie Tales version, where they slap people with fishes. I don't think that was actually the wickedness that had come up before God, but it's not always easy. But it is a simple message, and it is our message. It is the message God has given to us that we need to take out to the world. Now, this great city, Nineveh, it was located on the east bank of the Tigris. It later became the capital of Assyria. During this time, it wasn't the capital quite yet. It did become that capital a little bit later. But it was a big city, obviously, a great city. There was lots of terraces and palaces, and they had arsenals there, and barracks and libraries and temples to very many different gods. They were very polytheistic. They worshiped a lot of different gods. The walls were so big that you could ride chariots, several chariots, side by side on the walls around the city. So it was a big city. It was a great city. It was an important city in the Assyrian Empire. In chapter 4, at the end of chapter 4, which we'll get to later, the Bible says that there was 120,000 people who didn't know their left hand from their right hand. Now, I've done a lot of study on this, and some people say that 120,000 was the entire city, that they were all kind of morons that didn't know their right hand from their left hand. A lot of people also believe that 120,000 was an indication of like children that hadn't come to the age of accountability, which kind of makes more sense to me. I don't think God was calling them all people that didn't know their right from their left. So estimations of the city around that time are anywhere from 120,000 all the way up to 1 million. So there was, any way you look at it, a lot of people. So it was a big city. It had a lot of people in it. And it was one that the Bible also says would take 3 days to walk around. So, big city, right? And then it says that their wickedness has come up before me. So what is their wickedness? I don't think it was actually slapping with the fish, even though that's a good story. I did enjoy that. But Jonah doesn't really go into the details of what their wickedness was. Nahum, who comes a little bit after Jonah, he talks specifically of evil plots against God, exploitations of the helpless, cruelty and war, idolatry, prostitution, witchcraft, all the bad stuff, right? And then historically, if you look back at the Assyrian Empire historically, they were the cruelest of cruel, right? I mean, it would be if ISIS suddenly got to control our military power, right? The United States military suddenly becomes under the control of ISIS, and what kind of carnage would come of that? The Assyrians were, people that historically would skin people and use their skin as wallpaper. They would put people on pikes and leave them out for the enemies. In fact, there are a lot of historical records where entire towns, entire cities, when the Assyrians were coming, they're like, I'm just going to go ahead and kill myself now, because whatever they're going to do to me is going to be a lot worse than anything that I could do to myself. So there's, historically stories where entire towns, villages, people would just commit suicide because they didn't want to get captured. They didn't want to be under that Assyrian rule. So they were a very, obviously, wicked people. And something that people didn't want to get caught up in. And Jonah, no doubt, knew all this. The Assyrians had been a thorn in Israel's side for a long time, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But the important thing here is that the wickedness of the people had come up before God. And God notices wickedness, right? It stinks to God. He knows it, he sees it, he recognizes it, and he sees our wickedness as well. No matter how much we try to hide it, no matter how much we think that nobody knows what's going on in our lives, and no matter how much we try to avoid publicizing the things that we do, God knows our wickedness. Sometimes we think we got away with stuff. We don't get away with anything. God doesn't miss it. He's long-suffering. He's merciful. He's all these things, thankfully to us, because our wickedness comes up before him. So we need to be careful of those things, and we need to be thinking about those things as we go through our lives. And realizing that God hates our sin, hates the sin of the world, and we need to live every day trying to get closer to him and to get away from any wickedness that we have. But we'll see here in verse 3 as we carry on. But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare thereof, and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Anytime I say the word Tarshish, it just makes me think like I have a speech thing going on. But Tarshish is a place that is totally on the other side of the world, right? Jonah decided here that though he had a clear call from God to go, he had a clear answer of no, right? God said go, Jonah said no. He didn't even think about it, right? I mean, the Bible doesn't give any indication that he prayed about it, that he talked to God about it. Now later on, he kind of does reveal that he told God, why he didn't want to go. But at this point, he just says no. And no matter how far we run, no matter how fast we try to run, we can't outrun God, right? Jeremiah 23. Let's flip over there. Jeremiah 23, verse 24. A familiar verse. Jeremiah 23:24. Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him, saith the Lord? Do not I fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord? God knows, right? God knows where we're at. No matter how hard we try to run, whether it be physically or spiritually or whatever, when we try to distance ourselves from God, we're not going to get anywhere. He knows where we're at, and he always sees what's going on. We can't outrun God. And when we sin, our natural instinct is to run from God, right? You see it throughout the Bible. Adam and Eve, they sinned, they ran from God, right? You think of, Lot. He looked out, he saw that the plan was good. Rather than stay and do what he should, he moved towards the city. Esau, what good is a birthright if I'm going to die? Sinning and not worrying about it and trying to bury your head and kind of go the other way. But a big distinction here is that typically we see that these people run from God. Why? Because they disappointed God, right? Here, Jonah's not running because he sinned in disappointment of God. He's running because God's wrong, right? At least that's kind of what his view on it is. So in contrast to most of us when we run because we know we're wrong and we've done something wrong, incorrect, or we've sinned against God. Jonah here isn't running necessarily because he sinned against God. He's running because he thinks God's making a bad decision. He's trying to put God in his box and what he kind of thinks God should do and God should look. And Jonah's lived his entire life with God kind of staying in that box for him, right? He's never seen anything from God. And now he's saying, whoa, this ain't right. What's he doing here? This isn't This isn't the God that And he's turning his back. He's making a willing, obvious decision just to go totally against what his commandment is because he disagrees. Now, we might come up in times in our lives where we think that, God's not doing right as well. Now, most of us would never say it. Most of us wouldn't do what Jonah did here, right? But it was obvious. Jonah's willful disobedience was a righteous anger. He thought he was right. And righteous anger is dangerous, right? Because when you get mad at somebody and you lash out, what happens? You feel guilt about it usually, right? Or you say something you shouldn't have said. Man, you know what? Now I'm going to have to tell him I'm sorry. But this wasn't the kind of anger that Jonah had here. He had righteous anger. When you lash out at somebody and you think you're right, that apology is going to be a lot harder to come by, right? I could apologize because technically I shouldn't have said it. But it's the truth and they needed to hear it, right? I'm not going to apologize for that because I'm right. And this is kind of where Jonah is here. I'm running, not going to do what God tells me to do, but it doesn't bother me any. You can see it doesn't bother him here in the next couple verses when he just conks out to sleep, right? He's righteous in his anger here. He thinks, I'm right, I know better. What you're doing is wrong. What you're doing isn't what I've known you to do. This doesn't make sense to me. And so he thinks that he's right. And he's not going just a little bit out of the way, right? So, you got the Mediterranean Sea, you got Gath-Hepher, you got Nineveh up here, and he wants to go over here to Tarshish. Now, we don't know exactly where Tarshish was. There's a lot of speculation. But generally speaking, people think that it was in Spain and that it was about 2,500 miles away. Not a small trip, right? So when he pays the guys to go to Tarshish, he's probably paying them a lot of money. Because this isn't a short trip. This isn't just, I'm going to just go over here for a minute. This is, I'm going to the westernmost part of the known world. If I go fast enough, maybe God will start those 40 days now, and I don't have to worry about Nineveh. They'll just die while I'm on the boat. And we don't really know what he was thinking there. But he's going to the westernmost part of the known world. Some people think that he rented the entire ship because that wasn't a common passage. I don't know. The Bible kind of gives the indication that he found a boat that was going to Tarshish and he hopped on it. I tend to think that's probably what happened. But like I said, any way you look at it, he paid a lot of money for this fare, right? This wasn't just a drive to Louisville. This was, an air flight to Australia. This is something that he's paying a lot of money for. And isn't it true that we don't want to pay the wages for our sin, right? Because the wages of sin are death, right? We don't want to pay the wages for our sin. But the wages to sin, we don't have a big problem with a lot of the time. When it comes down to doing what we want to do, we can find the money for that, right? No matter what it might be, even if it's running away from God, when we find something that goes with what we desire or what we think is best, we don't have the problem coming up with the money for this. And Jonah, paid his fare, hopped on a boat. Sin's not worth it, obviously. We see later here that Jonah figures out that sin isn't worth it, running from God isn't worth it, because you're going to get caught. Because you can't hide from God, right? You can't run from God. He's going to find you. He knows where you're at. So here's the next question then. So why did Jonah not go to Nineveh? We don't know, we know why he doesn't go to Jonah. Let's go over to chapter 4, verse 2 real quick in Jonah. He tells us why he doesn't go. He tells God here. And he prayed unto the Lord and said, I pray thee, O Lord, was not this my saying when I was yet in my country? Therefore I fled before unto Tarshish. For I knew that thou art a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil. So we know why Jonah split, right? He wanted the Ninevites to die. But why did Jonah want the Ninevites to die? Was there some like big struggle? Did somebody in Nineveh, beat up his horse? Like the Bible doesn't exactly say for sure what, but we know historically that the Ninevites were evil. We know historically that the Ninevites, the Assyrians in general, had been a thorn in Israel's flesh. In going back to 2 Kings, we don't have to flip back over there for the sake of time, but going back to 2 Kings, we know that he prophesied in the year of Jeroboam. Jeroboam II was a king in the northern kingdom. He was a wicked king. He wasn't a good king. But during the time of Jeroboam II, Israel kind of prospered. Because of God's mercy, for whatever reason, God allowed them to prosper during that time. Now, Israel had been paying tribute to Assyria for years and years and years. They had been weakened by Assyria. Assyria was, like I said, a evil, country there to them. And here in Jonah's time, it seems like Israel's getting stronger, because what was the prophecy? You're going to get land back. This is the prophecy Jonah likes, right? He gets to go to the king and say, hey, king, God told me you're going to get more land. You're going to reconquer some of the stuff that we had lost. This is what Jonah thinks, this is the good kind of prophecies. These are the good things to tell. I like going to the king and saying, hey, we're going to get bigger. Hey, we're going to be prosperous. So we know that during this time, Israel's getting a little bit more strength, getting a little bit more. And Assyria is seemingly getting a little bit weaker. And Jonah's thinking, now what? If I do this thing, Israel's getting some strength and Assyria's and God repents of it, which I know he's going to do because he's God and that's just, how he works, then Assyria is going to get more power. Israel is going to be in a bad place again. If Assyria gets stronger, it's not good for me and my country. So politically, it kind of seems like Jonah is focused on the wealth and prosperity of Israel, which we can all understand, right? We don't like it when people kneel for the national anthem. We don't like it when people disrespect the flag. We don't like it when people do things against our country. And so that's not inherently a bad thing, obviously. But you need to be careful when you're putting your allegiance to something other than God. Now, I don't know that was Jonah's total, this is, somewhat speculation here. But it kind of, it plays in together. Now, aside from that, also, Jonah, up to this point, prophets had been prophesying to Israel, right? So like the Jews in the New Testament that thought that God was for Israel, Jonah appears to kind of have that same attitude. God's for us, not for them. They're evil. They're wicked. They do bad stuff. Now, also, play into that same thing. What would we want if we were told to go and go to Baghdad or go to somewhere in the middle of Afghanistan and tell them they're all going to die in 40 days? I mean, we don't want... There are people that we view in our lives, right, that not necessarily in our lives, but in our world that don't deserve God's grace. We love God's grace for us because we're not that bad. But those guys on death row, they've done some wicked stuff. They don't deserve grace. They deserve to die. And it's an easy thing to get caught up in. It's an easy thing to rationalize, to justify. But God doesn't fit in Jonah's box as much as Jonah wants him to. God doesn't see things the same way. A lot of people speculate that it was fear that kept Jonah from going because it was a tough message to a tough people. Jonah gives no indication of fear to me. I mean, it doesn't look like he's afraid of much. He's willing to die for his convictions, even though they're not totally founded in the right place. He's ready to die for it. Throw me overboard. How many times in the book does he say, no, I'm mad enough to die? Yeah, kill me. It's better that I die than have to live with a God that I don't understand, that I don't think is doing the right thing. And we all have storms in our lives. We all have struggles in our lives where that's real to us too. We see, baby Joseph and all the stuff going on. I mean, if you, especially, we're close enough to it, but if you were real close, how do you understand that? God, do you know what you're doing here? And it's easy to kind of fall into that and to be swayed and justify your own feelings towards things. But we can't use those things as a ruler, right? We have to use God as our ruler. And he's given us everything we need here in the Word of God. So I don't think fear played into it at all. Jonah didn't want Nineveh spared. He knew that God would spare them. Assyria was getting weaker, like I said. And God doesn't see things like we see things. And I was going to flip over to 1 Samuel 16, but we'll skip that. We all know that verse where, God's looking for David. And he goes, don't pay any attention to how tall he is. Don't pay any attention to any of that stuff. Because what you guys are seeing, I'm not seeing. What you see, Samuel, isn't the same thing that I see. I'm looking at the heart. And that's what God's looking at here with the Ninevites. It's like, I see all the wickedness. In fact, I already said their wickedness has come up before me. But in my mercy, in my grace, I care about these people. And we see later on, and we'll get to that, where God tells them, like, look, everybody means something to me. Even the people that you think are the worst, even the people that you don't think deserve mercy, that you don't think deserve grace, they deserve it because I say so. And so we see that. Let's go ahead and read verse 4. But the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. So we see here the first miracle in the book. It was a great tempest that came up. The first thing we notice here is Jonah's sin is his willful ignoring of God's directive, and how that it has major consequences. So major that it disrupts the entire balance of nature. Right? This wasn't a normal storm. Everybody in the ship knew it. And they were trying to figure out what's going on with this storm. But this great tempest comes up. And the Lord doesn't just sit idly by when we sin against him. This here is a storm of correction. I've talked about it before. The storm of correction, the storm of perfection. The storms that come in our life to perfect us, to mature us, to make us stronger. That is, like when the disciples, after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus sends the disciples away, goes up and prays. Great storm comes on the water. Jesus comes out to the boat, right? That was a storm of perfection. That was to give so the disciples could see the strength of the Lord, they could see the Lord, and they could see and increase their faith. We have storms in our lives that do the same thing. We don't always know why we're getting them. Now what about the ship guys? What's the storm to them? They're just kind of, collateral damage in Jonah's messed up world over here. And we'll get to that a little bit more. But we've got the storms of correction that Jonah's going through here. The storms coming up, correcting. Now, like Brother Phil talked about on Sunday night. It's not necessarily punishment all the time. Sometimes it's just a little spank to get you back on the right track, Correcting your path. So we have the storms of correction. We have the storms of perfection. And then I heard a new one while I was studying this, which I really enjoyed, which was a storm of direction. Now, that was one that I had, I guess you could kind of fit it into the storm of perfection. But the storm of correction. Now, of direction. Now, that would be kind of like when Paul was on the boat. He was a prisoner. He was on the boat with, I don't know, I wrote it down here, 276 souls, and they were on their way to Rome, where he was ultimately going to speak. And there was storms, days of storms, till finally there was a shipwreck. He comes up on Melita, I don't know, Malta, present day. And it's a very familiar story where he's gathering the firewood, the snake comes out, bites him on the hand, and everybody's like, wow, that guy's done something really badly. He got off the shipwreck, but now he's going to die, and Paul just kind of throws it off and moves on with life, and everything's good. But then we see, what does Paul ultimately, while he's there, he heals Publius and many others that had disease. Now, I don't know exactly why God did this, but for whatever reason, that's really the only thing that happens, biblically speaking, while he's on the island for however many months. God wanted Paul there for a purpose. To be there so that he could help those people that were really nasty sick and to serve them. So there are times in our lives where we might be going through storms, where maybe we're being corrected. Maybe we're being perfected. We're getting some maturity. Or maybe God needs us there. For whatever reason. We might not ever know the reason. We might do something seemingly, small and tiny and insignificant to ourselves. But in that person's world, who knows what we've been in. So there are times in our lives where all of these things can be true. And so it's up to us, obviously, and through prayer and study and to figure these things out. And if we don't figure it out, we still know who's in control, right? We still know what's going on. And I made it through 4 of my 7 pages, so, not too bad a start. If I go too much longer, my wife will get mad at me, so. But anyway, we made it through verse 4, so we'll pick it up a little bit as we go forward. But understanding God loves us. But God loves the people we don't love too. The people that we don't think deserve God's mercy. He loves them. And he's going to provide a way for them whether we like it or not. Now what Jonah could have happened to Jonah is he might have never come out of the whale and God just said, okay, next, you go. So Jonah enjoys God's grace. He doesn't want it for the other people. We've got to be careful about our attitude towards those things and our heart towards those things. And understand that a storm in our life isn't always something that's a punishment. Sometimes it's a correction. We need to get back on path. Sometimes it's just for us to get better, stronger Christian. And sometimes it's because we need to be there for somebody else. All right, I'll pray. Dear Father, Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time that we could come and open your word, Lord, and read through the book of Jonah and learn what you would have for us, Lord. Just pray that you'd be with us as we read these things, as we study your word, that we would rightly divide your word, and that we would see what you would have for each and every one of us, Lord. We thank you for all you've given us. Be with us as we go home. Keep us safe and bring us back on Sunday, Lord. I ask all these things in your name. Amen.